it truly started way back in the early 1900s. You know, when behind me here, there's a declaration of the Lillooet tribe. And in there, it says that we seek a measure of justice. And I think that was the actual foundation of what we have to do in the future, which is now. So in kicking off this hydro negotiations process, there was 3 communities that were initially going to be impacted by a new line that BC Hydro wanted to put in. And the communities were Pavilion, also known as Squilach, Huiston, Bridge River, and Shalath. Those were the 3 main communities. So that started initially, I think, in the late 1980s. And in 1990, the chiefs were having a meeting in Mission, BC. And the 3 affected communities, they said that they're not going to talk to Hydro unless the whole Stadtdam Nation was involved to take care of any and all past grievances or any grievances with BC Hydro before allowing that new line to be put in. That was the start of it. And I don't think that the 3 communities have been thanked enough for that.
BC Hydro first started developing the project, which is known as the Bridge River hydroelectric system, in the early 20s, early 30s. And they drilled 1 tunnel through Mission Mountain, put in a small powerhouse that produced maybe 30 megawatts. I don't know what the exact number is. And then there was, of course, depression. And then there was a war, and they started redeveloping the project in the early 50s. And now we have 3 dams that are in place with 4 power generating facilities that provides probably up to 5 to 7% of the province's power. It's the most efficient hydroelectric facility that BC Hydro has because when they drilled the tunnels through Mission Mountain, there's a drop of about 1,200 feet. So it gives you a little bit more efficiency in terms of producing power. For our community, they took about close to a quarter of our land. And a lot of it is lakefront property. So we got together and started talking about it. It took several years of discussion amongst the communities before we eventually decided that we needed to get together and join forces and talk about the multitude of issues that we have with BC Hydro.
In 1973, I was elected chief in Bridge River, and it truly was a matter of needing help there to help the whole community. The community, we didn't have any electrical service of any kind. We had no running water, hot or cold, in many homes, and there were only about 10 homes in the whole reserve. Essentially no school-age children in the whole community because they were still being sent away to Kamloops at that time in 1970 through 78. So that essentially was the beginning of getting to know Hydro's role within the whole territory.
It might be well to review a few facts concerning its relationship to the BC Electric's Bridge River power development. The area of the development centers around the Bridge River Valley, about 110 miles due north of Vancouver, a few miles above the town of Lillooet. En route, it passes within 3 miles of the adjoining Seton Lake watercourse. Here, through a difference of 1,200 feet in elevation between the 2 water systems, nature provided an ideal site for the development of hydroelectric power.
Well, initially, it was Tleetla that started the ball rolling with respect with hydro, with respect to Seton Lake Iron number 5, which is 72.5 acres, and it was kind of a deal with General Electric back in the 50s, where we felt it was inappropriate for them to take the amount of land for what they were planning to do. And so they took 72.5 acres, but they left five acres in reserve status. And when I became chief, I read their agreements, and you could tell that there was duress placed on people back then in terms of getting a vote to expropriate the land. So I challenged that, and then so that went on for about 5 years, and then Hydro decided that they wanted to negotiate hydro agreements with the nation as a whole and communities. And so I decided to put that subject on the inventory for the community.
In 1989, BC Hydro approached the BC Utilities Commission to put in a 500 kV line from Kelly Lake to Chikai. And seeing that this proposal landed on 3 of the reservations, initiated a federal review, and the 3 communities that the proposed transmission line was going through got together, was associated with the Lillooet Tribal Council. The Lillooet Tribal Council consists of the northern communities of the St'át'imc Nation. And this issue was brought to that level of discussion, and each of the communities had issues with BC Hydro, unresolved issues. And BC Hydro really wanted this 500 kV line, which prompted 1993 protocol agreement, which indicated that we will provide you, we'll discuss this 500 kV line, but we have a lot of issues with BC Hydro in regards to their transmission lines, their transmission corridors, their dams, their facilities within St'át'imc territory. We began the discussions, and at the community tables, we raised a lot of issues. We sat down and discussed this on a collective basis and indicated that let's combine our grievances so that all the communities have the same grievances.
The original intent wasn't to achieve a multi-stage, comprehensive type agreement with BC Hydro. Hydro came to the 3 communities several years ago, a couple of decades ago actually, and said that they wanted to put a new 500 kilovolt transmission line in from Kelly Lake to Chikai, which would have run right beside some other high voltage transmission lines that run through the territory. So at that point, the 3 communities sat down and said, well, we have some long-standing issues with BC Hydro, but those don't just fall on 3 communities. So they collaborated, and the chiefs of the day decided that they were going to open this opportunity up to the rest of the communities in the St'át'imc and see if we can get more of these long-standing issues resolved, because Hydro, when they came, they took land, they flooded valleys, they built transmission lines in through, or in some cases, right over communities. So wire transmission lines were running right through over communities' heads, and they had no opportunity to connect to the grid. But we had numerous impacts. So the discussion was held at the chief's table to see if it is possible to enter into a broader type of negotiations with BC Hydro.
Communities that back then weren't really involved. It was basically Indian agents and other people involved mostly, and basically, so there was issues around how they built roads in the reserve and, access to land, and damaged things like crops and water lines and roads. So those are some of the things I remember from our community. Hydro was looking to increase the KVs and the power line through our reserve, and I think there was a number of reserves that were involved at the time. And well, everybody kind of had issues with the whole thing, so not so much the new line, but the whole history of Hydro and the territory and the reserves.
I'll give you an idea of how it actually started. Oiluk did a negotiation with Hydro. We were suing Hydro for trespass, and they had these little agreements where they would pay the band something like $1,000 a year or something like that for 10 years, and
It was a ridiculous amount, considering the amount of land that they were using. And they got away with it up until that time. And Marvin Bob was the chief at the time. He threw me the paper and said, "Take a look at that." And I read it, and I was looking at it, and it wasn't right. And they wanted us to sign it and renew it and send it back to them. We said no. And they kept after us to sign them, and we said, no, we're not going to sign them. So what we did was we got our lawyer to file a trespass claim because they were on the land without any compensation to the band. So we went through a whole negotiation process over a period of time that ended in March. And after that, they realized that they had to do the whole tribe. Well, at first they wanted to do Seton, Bridge River, and Tchwailoch. And then we said, no, there's 8 other communities in the Sh'aklim tribe. So what we did was we said, we won't continue until they pull in the rest of the communities. So from the first 3, we managed to eventually get all of the other communities on board.
We started to see that there was more to this issue than was just simply a road right-of-way or a domestic service needs. And that really essentially was the beginning of our dealings with BC Hydro. Because when we met with them, it wasn't only Bridge River that was being impacted. The common reserve between the Bridge River Band and the Lillooet Band, we had common lands in between that were being impacted as well. And so that expanded the interest in addressing that issue. So the Bridge River Band and Lillooet Band, we brought it to the Lillooet Tribal Council table at that time and mentioned the issue to other chiefs, and all of a sudden other chiefs and community leaders said, yeah, we're having problems as well. And so therefore it came to be that the tribe itself was highly impacted by BC Hydro. I think they were offering, if we settled in 3 years, we'd get $2 million or something. But they said if we can get it previous to 3 years, to say within 2 years, we can settle the matter, we'll get $3 million. We can split. Well, sounded like a lot of money for a community that really was cash strapped and needing a lot of help that way. But we discussed the matter and continued the dialogue with them, and they began to realize that they had to deal with more than just 2 communities there, or 3 communities.
The Delgamuth people up north brought this issue right to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada indicated that title was not extinguished in British Columbia, and the tribes that do not have a treaty hold their title. That was the ruling. So that opened our discussions into the territory, because the only issues that were going to be resolved through prior to that was reservation issues, right away through our reserves, canal rights away, transmission rights away. The Delgamuth opened up the impact on our territory, which meant our hunting, fishing, all these things that hydro impacted on, especially at the Bridge River where many of our people hunted. They flooded that area. It destroyed a huge fisheries population. It flooded prime salmon habitat, so that fisheries was destroyed. When they put up another dam on Seton, that interrupted that fisheries. So on a collective basis, this was impacting the whole territory, which basically got the communities together, because all these areas were interconnected by the communities. So that's prompted a larger involvement with the total tribe.
It's just looking at a way of life. When you look at it, non-First Nations, it's the fence that defines the land. And for First Nations, It was the ability to walk outside and pick your husham, to pick your strawberries, to pick your raspberries, to pick your Jocham or Saskatoon berries. It's the ability to walk outside and not have to worry about traveling for miles to get your grouse or rabbit or your geese or your moose. They're right there. That was valuable to us.
To give you a sense of how the impact was felt by the communities with facing high voltage transmission lines and rights of ways. So across Canada, there was a general principle of 160 acres per family. And that determined generally the size of the reserves that were allocated. In British Columbia, British Columbia was the last province to join Confederation. And the person in charge was, in my view, a complete racist, Joseph Trutch. And I mean, if you look at some of his writings, it's documented already in terms of when he talked about allocating lands to Indians. He says Indians need lands like bears and cougars for sustenance only. They're not farmers. So that determined the size of the reserves, and the formula used was generally 10 acres per family. In BC, you find our reserves are generally around the tributaries, so our fishing spots. Once in a while you go up in the mountains and you find reserves up there, but they're very small. It doesn't matter where you go in this province, there's just isolated small little reserves. And those reserves were even cut back, scaled back a little later. So in the face of that, so that was, the 1900s, and the development started in 1950s. Most of the bands didn't even have a band office at that time. Like Hachlip, none of them really had a band office. They had an Indian agent that was coming around and getting them to sign papers every once in a while and sign over land for whatever development was happening.
I believe it is in the late 80s that Hydro approached the three communities about the new transmission line that they proposed, and the concern was that it is going to parallel some of the other existing lines, and it is going to take away more reserve land, which is precious to us, because in Shalath, for example, by that time they took anywhere between a quarter to a third of our reserve land already without adequate compensation and significant impact, because they have generating facilities, they have transmission facilities, as well as the transmission lines and distribution lines that all trans-sector traverse our valley and the community.
The impacts to land were felt significantly by the people who were using the land just to get by and try to sustain themselves. And so it became, when we looked at, how do you compensate that? Because the biggest problem and one of the biggest hurdles that we faced in this negotiation for both sides, BC Hydro, for the Stadtteam, and for the province of British Columbia, was how much. It took up so much of our time and so much of everybody's time and energy trying to answer that one question. And it meant different things for families. For some families, there was never enough compensation to address the impacts that they faced. But we did, we had to quantify it. And, we came in with a big number, but our number was an informed one. We hired a specialist, an expert. He looked at what life was like pre-development, almost pre-contact, and how the people sustained themselves and how they attribute value to their lands and value to the water and value to all the things that they utilize in life. Then he looked at the time frame during development, during construction, when all of these hydro dams were being installed and all the hydro lines being constructed, and the last period where it's just simply operational now. Then the lines have been in place for a while, the dams have been in place. And what he looked at was, he measured the value to the people before construction and pre-operation, and compared the two values with all those in those systems. And what he came up with was a number of opportunity cost. What has been the cost of this opportunity and this development to the Stadtteam? And it was a big number because they were marginalized from it all. So they faced all of the impacts, suffered all of the loss, and all of the benefits, at least 90, probably over 90% of them, were going to BC Hydro or pre-BC Hydro to private companies. They're the ones that enjoyed all of the benefits from it.
This agreement basically is the first government-to-government relationship being established between the provincial government and our communities, the 11 communities of the Schlatlium. And what went from there is that Hydro then decided they wanted to make an offer, which was a very small offer, so we rejected that. And then they made another offer, so we rejected that. And then we told them basically, you're going to deal with the nation, not just the communities. So they went back and they did their thinking and I guess discussions amongst themselves and came back, and they probably had talks with the government because we were establishing that government-to-government process, and so everything moved ahead from there, and we were quite frank that there's two types of agreements that need to come out of these negotiations: is a nation agreement and a community agreement.
This is the heartbreaking part of the story. So the impacts on the Stalium territory from BC Hydro operations has been significant. There's three runs of fish that were destroyed or decimated or almost destroyed with the creation of the dam. There was a court case, 91-92 court case with DFO over the impacts to the fish. The communities continue to feel the impacts because of the construction and operation of the Bridge Seaton facilities from BC Hydro. So it was painful to see. You come here and you start reading the historical background on some of these transactions. Transactions weren't always done in an ethical way. So when you start diving into some of the permitting stuff, it was really heartbreaking to see how the land was taken. The Stalium are the ones that are suffering the impacts, and they didn't have any benefits from this aside from the same benefits that everyone had through of electricity, right? Impacts to their culture, heritage, impacts obviously the fish, the wildlife. One of the hardest things that we did in the negotiation process was interview the elders. And hearing the stories from the elders throughout the territory was hard. We went and talked to Annie Jim, who was Rose Smith's from Shamaquan's mom, and she was in her 90s, and she remembered when Hydro came and the promises that they made to the people. And she was angry because the promises weren't upheld by BC Hydro. But the impacts were real. There's one meeting in Shalath where all the elders spoke only in the language. And so obviously the Hydro representatives there didn't understand what was being said. And they did that intentionally to make sure that Hydro knew how it felt. When they came, the BC Electric people came in and talked to the communities. They didn't understand half the time what was going on. A lot of those elders didn't speak English. They didn't understand what they were being asked to sign. And that was a really powerful meeting over in Shalath where that happened, and Hydro got the point pretty clearly that day.
They had a transmission line that was put through the valley beside Lillooet River, and they weren't, their communities weren't hooked up to electricity. They were on diesel generation, and it was very difficult for members in the community. They had brownouts, and they had a difficult time generating enough electricity from diesel. So that was one of the main things that the Stalium Chiefs Council had made a directive to negotiate, was to get the three southern communities hooked up to the electric grid. And the transmission line had run through their reserves and through their territory for the last 50 years.
First of all, the flooding of the Bridge River Valley impacted a lot of the families. Some of the families were actually standing on their roof when they flooded that area. It destroyed moose habitat, it destroyed prime fisheries, salmon spawning habitat. One of our prime fisheries was the spring salmon, and that wiped out the spring salmon within the Bridge River Valley. So the loss of the spring salmon as a fisheries was a great impact on our communities up and down the river. The fact that the deer populations were severed in regards to their inability to follow their original migration routes because Carpenter Dam was flooded, that diminished some of the deer populations, the ungulates, the moose. All that impacted the bear, and it impacted our hunting ability, our fishing ability. The loss of the fisheries had to go look at another source. Rather than going fishing in your backyard, you had to go to a further away. When you destroy that run, you can't get that fishery back. So they had to depend on other runs to supplement their winter supply. Their inability in the short term after the flooding of the dam to access deer, their mowage for their winter supplies, it disrupted our food supply, our ability to move around in our appropriate hunting areas. It devastated our communities in regards to adjusting to this huge impact that had on the land.
Where to start? We'll start with the dams. The dams, the biggest impact was to our fisheries. When we were little, we used to walk along and pick up these fish. They would spawn and then float to the top. So we would walk through, and there was so much fish there. Like we were probably 8. So we would be walking in some parts of it where the fish were up to our knees. And now you're lucky if you walk along and see 1 or 2. So it's had that huge impact on the Wanish. The elders talk about one of the rocks where the Alexanders lived. It was a rock that had a spirit in it. Hydro and highways agreed, without even talking to the elders or anybody, to just blast it out of there. They just blasted this rock out of there. I know when they were coming through, when they put the lines and everything in, every one of our elders that was at these meetings said, we were promised free hydro. They keep going back and saying, well, it wasn't in writing. So therefore, we can't honor that. And we don't believe any of our guys would have ever said that you would have got free hydro.
Well, for my community, if you can think about losing a quarter of your land, like we have 2 powerhouses that each have 4 turbines each, with a number of transformers, substations, transmission lines. Altogether, we have close to 14 transmission lines that originate or go through our community, including a 500 kV line, a couple of 360 kV lines, and a number of smaller lines. And I think the big issue for us is just the impact on Seton Lake itself. When you look at Seton Lake and you compare it to Anderson Lake, which is right next door to our community, you could see the drastic change just in the color of the lake, but also the fact that it's a lot colder and had a huge impact on fisheries, recreation, social, and the diversion. Well, it all started with the diversion of the Bridge River into Seton Lake, because when they dammed the Bridge River, they diverted all of the water through to the Bridge River facilities. And that's where the 8 turbines are at Chilaz. And Bridge River Valley is known as a Valley of Plenty to the Stepien, and it was used by and for all of our people. It provided hunting, fishing, trapping, food gather and medicine gather and all of that, and had a lot of wildlife, mule deer and moose and other animals used that valley a lot. And so just the damming of the Bridge River itself had a huge impact. Our people called it the Valley of Plenty, and through the process of doing oral testimony with our elders and our communities, we learned, how valuable and what value the valley had to our tribe, to our nation.
When they started concepting the hydro dams and everything like that, they displaced Seton, Chilaz, Cayush, and Darcy, and Montcurry. So they displaced a half a dozen bands. There were fishing sites up at the head of the river where the lake is there. My great-grandmother They have a picture of her in a fish rack up there. Now it's a public swimming area and cemented over. There are a lot of far-reaching things that I talk to the elders about, and I talk to them all the way down the other end of the tribe, all the way up through, I met with a lot of the elders, and they told me little things like, in order for hydro to get the lines where they wanted them to, they were going around telling people, oh, you'll get free electricity and everything like that. So our elders were waiting for that day to come. When are we going to get our free electricity for allowing them to go through the area that was gardened? So they discontinued their gardens because they couldn't run water down through the hydro area.
For one family, they lost their home. It was in an area called the Valley of Plenty, and they done all their hunting, all their fishing there, and the kids were off to residential school, and they come home and their land and house was flooded. Parents only had about 24 hours to evacuate. It had to be united, it had to be a nation. It couldn't be any other way. And that was part of the discussions that took place, was how each were going to be compensated, because each were affected differently by hydro facilities. They were all in the same frame of mind, and there was different perspectives, like how it should be done. So they had a lot of discussions on how it should be, how the compensation should be divided or even thought of, because a lot of the topics up for discussion, a value couldn't be put to them, like the salmon or the water or the hunting areas or land values. We didn't know how to put the dollar figures to those items.
It had created an opportunity for us to be a nation and deal with all our territory lands. So even though it dealt with the community issues and the grievances, we also created a table where as a nation can deal with the whole territory. Anything that's within our territory, we were able to, have some kind of agreement with Hydro to deal with anything that's going to happen within that territory. So our Stadium territory is important that, to us as landholders or look after the land within our territory, it is important that, that we all stick together and then be able to work towards that goal of protecting our territory. And so if we can get an agreement that recognizes our territory, that, to me it was important that this is one of the areas that our territory is recognized, and it's actually identified, under this agreement, so that anything within that territory that Hydro needs to deal with us as a nation, as a community, so basically it's a nation agreement, but with community input.
The significance was they were asking consent. That was the main thing, that they were asking consent of the people in which they built their facilities within our territories, used our territories without our consent, and now they're here to ask for our consent. And with no extinguishment, we agreed to enter. And then, so that gave every person an opportunity to vote yes or no. Underlying factor was that we have Stadium title and rights, and if you want an agreement, you need our consent. And since you haven't achieved our consent to this point, you never asked us, now you're asking us. So now we're prepared to give you an answer. And it's not just about compensation, it's about a relationship. That was very important, because the BC treaty process, you sign an agreement and then they give you money and then that's about it. But here, there's a relationship agreement that keeps this agreement flowing for generation to generation. So that was the main thing, was all, consent. And the declaration of the Lolo tribe, and we maintained this during the negotiation, that this was but a small measure of justice. It was not the total answer to our issues between the provincial and the federal governments, not by long shot. Those were, so that was our kind of like our war cry, is a small measure of justice. And BC Hydro loved that because they understand that this is an ongoing agreement. There could be changes to the facilities, there could be, changes in the environment and those kind of things that will impact how hydro operates. So that's why I was indicating very clearly when I was the lead negotiator at the final parts of the agreement, indicating that relationship agreement and the consent issue had to be resolved. Mm-hmm.